Welcome to the Enduro Method podcast. Enduro Method is an online strength and conditioning program built for those who ride by those who ride. We are professional coaches dedicated to building the best and most revolutionary off-the-bike training for dirt bikers around. We are offering a special discount for our podcast listeners. Use discount code EMPodcast22 for 50% off your first month. For more information, head to the description of this podcast where you can find the discount code and a link for more information and to sign up.
And we're live. Awesome. Joined today with Mike Tlusty from Deja Moto. Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into it, let's maybe just give a little brief history of you, how you got started on suspension.
Oh boy. I got started on suspension honestly more out of necessity than anything. I was racing most of my peak racing years were probably 2008 to 2014-ish. And so with that, you're trying to maintain your equipment as best you can, keep it operating in its best form. And so one of those things, suspension service intervals. And then also as my ability level increased, I felt like I needed a little more out of the machine. And so I got my start basically tinkering with my own stuff. Again, to be able to just do these service intervals quickly and cheap, rather than having to rely on somebody else to do it. And then B, just to be able to kind of fine tune a few things to my liking. There were resources locally that I was friends with, and they did help me and kind of get me on my way. But having a technical background in manufacturing and machining, I felt like it wasn't too much of a stretch for me to, try to do it on my own. And so, oh boy, it was one of those things that, you get started and you think you know something, and then here I am, gosh, it's going to be 10 plus years later, and every day I'm still learning. So yeah, got started out of necessity, and now, it was a slippery slope, and here I am doing it as part of my living.
From your experience so far, someone goes out, gets a new bike, and how important is it to get that dialed in the beginning?
Yeah, that's not a super easy answer. I think a lot of it depends on, there's a lot of factors. So usually one of the first things, when I'm having a suspension conversation with somebody is you step back and you look at the machine and say, what was this machine designed for? And then you look at the rider and you say, what are you trying to do with it? And so the further you're getting away from what that machine was designed for, the more important that getting your machine set up will be, and the bigger effect and the more confidence and inspiring it will be. So, like classic examples are, most machines are set up for that 160 to 180 pound rider. And then even within the different disciplines of riding, you'll have, within like the off-road riding, spectrum, let's put like a KTM 450 SXF at one end, and then a KTM 150 XCW at the other end. Because that's like within a family of bikes, you could go one direction towards like adventure riding, or the other direction towards, like KTM free ride or trials riding. But within like a similar, 18 or 19-inch rear wheel, 21-inch front, within that spectrum, there's a massive difference between a 450 SXF and a 150 XCW. So most people are pretty good about buying the machine that, for the intended use. But even like myself, like I ride a lot of enduro terrain now, but I don't have like an XCW, which is like a purpose-built enduro machine. I bought the XC, which is not that far off of it, but I had to be able to use it in Moto as well. So, So basically, the importance of getting it set up depends on how far you are away from what that machine was designed for. Weight wise, if you're 240 pounds or 140 pounds, spring rate's going to be your biggest, most effective step. Get the right springs in it. The next thing is, again, the intended discipline of riding. If you bought a 450 SXF and you want to go pound Rocky single track, it's going to need some valving work as well. So yeah, it's, again, it all depends on the individual and understanding what they want to do, and what the machine they chose to do it with will impact what path we take.
Right. No, it makes complete sense. And I feel, I mean, just from my experience, when I first started riding, the first bike I had, stock suspension, again, set up for that 160, 180 pound rider. With gear, I'm probably coming in at the time at like 230, somewhere in there, and hadn't touched the springs. I didn't even know that I could really at the time, And so it was years before I ever even did touch the suspension, never messed with the clickers, didn't do anything. And then as I progressed as a rider, I finally realized that it was detrimental, or like stuff was harder than it should be, and it wasn't handling great. And then the first thing I did was just change the springs out to get to the right weight for me. And that was just a monumental difference.
Sure. And I can't remember, did you do that on your own?
I had a buddy do it.
Okay. So, yeah, that's funny, a lot of one of the biggest questions I get is it worth it? Is XYZ upgrade worth it? And it's like, well, it's hard to gauge value, for you spending, even if you paid full retail, had a shop do it, so you pay, 200-300 some bucks to have springs installed, makes a massive difference, right?
Yeah.
If you're 190 pounds geared up, you're like just on the edge of that spring rate that the machine was intended for. You spend that same 300 bucks, you'd be like, yeah, it's different, but it's not like life-changing difference. And so, yeah, so for you, yeah, it was probably a big first noticeable difference, just getting it sprung correctly for your weight.
Right. And I think it's interesting because so many of these conversations are in that gray area, right? There's no, I don't think there's anything that's so set in stone that you can't discuss the pluses and minuses of it. Just like you're saying, like for that smaller rider, maybe spending the money is not worth it because
Sure.
the difference isn't as noticeable. But for somebody who's either way lighter or way heavier, just getting that springs in there is going to be worth the money to go out and do it.
Yep. And another thing too is just experience. So which comes at a cost. You gotta get out on the track or trails and just be riding and fumbling your way through all these different setup nuances. So I don't know how many times I've had somebody walk into the shop with $1,000 cash in their hand and say, my forks are unrideable, can you fix these? And I'm standing there looking, and it looks like a pretty new front tire on there. And then there's little ways in which you mount a front wheel, and so you look at the axle and you can tell that the front forks are bound up because of the axle installation procedure was maybe not done quite right. So you're like, okay, I see two things that could be contributing to the forks not working the way this individual wants them to work. And so you have a conversation, you're like, okay, when did you have the tire put on, yada yada yada. And this actually happened. I'm telling you an actual story of a guy that came in with $1,000 and said, I hate my forks, and ended up being, again, with the new tire on there. Yeah, I don't know. There's like 28 PSI in the tire, way too much pressure. Forks were all bound up by the axle. And then the air had never been let out of the bleeders. I mean, I about shot the little bleeders through the wall. There was so much air pressure in there. And so I got all that stuff set. I said, hey, you know what? Keep your cash for now. Go out and ride this weekend and let me know what you think. And the other thing too is I looked at it. It was a KTM XCW, right? So I'm like, man, and he was like a novice rider, and like 180 pounds geared up. I'm like, boy, this machine they spent a lot of money in engineering and designing this thing to work exactly for this rider. it can't be that unrideable. I know it's not that unrideable. So anyway, resolved those few little things, sent them out. He texted me on Monday. This thing works so much better. I'm like, okay. So again, like there's a cost of learning too, right? So could I have taken his money and done some tuning and also resolved those other things? Which, those were 90% of the problem. You could have, but that again, that's not what, I don't know. I guess that's just not me, but all that stuff comes at a cost. So sometimes experience, like you said, what's the best upgrade, maybe for a novice rider, is just like making sure you're not missing something else, rather than just kind of fixating on suspension. Because they all work together and they're all intertwined. Or like you said, it's kind of a gray area. You can't always compartmentalize one thing and that's the fix. It could be a combination of a bunch of things.
Right. I had a similar experience with it, not to name names, but one of the people I ride with a lot, and she had gone over the bars and just cranked out her front end, twisted it up, never really fixed it. No air out of the forks, similar. And she's like, hey, can you jump on this and ride it? And I just sat on it, and like the front wheels crank left while the handlebars are straight. This isn't the first time that there's been a crash in the recent, week.
Sure.
And like when I loosened everything up just to straighten it back out, it was like every bolt, as soon as it loosened, it was all crank, crank, crank. And then so straighten out the front end, redid the front tire, reset it, let the air out of the forks, and sure enough, next ride it was the same thing. It was like completely different bike.
Sure. Yeah. And that's the hard thing is, everyone's at a different point in their, I hate to come across all hippy dippy, but everyone's at a different point in their dirt biking journey as far as understanding these machines. And yeah, sometimes, 1 minute you're having a conversation about the absolute basics with somebody, and they don't deserve any less of your time than somebody who you've built 6 sets of suspension for, and you can have a really detailed, in-depth chassis handling suspension conversation with. I think that's what makes the whole thing so interesting. A lot of times, the people who are having these kind of more novice issues, that's some of the more gratifying work, because you're like a friggin' superhero for and this isn't stuff that you're going to charge people for. It's just like, hey, I'm glad you now know that. So I'm not like revalving something only to then have to undo it or do it differently because we were trying to resolve some other problem with tuning when it wasn't actually a tuning problem.
Right.
And so anyway, it's almost more gratifying working with, some of the more novice riders, just because you can get them sent down the right path for pretty much nothing.
Totally. Yeah, so I think a little bit of the moral of the story there is just spend some time and pay attention to what it feels like. Don't automatically assume, I guess within reason, right? Again, if you're on the heavy end or the light end compared to what it's sprung for, it's worth getting that done. But be patient, spend some time learning how stuff feels, play with the clickers, play with the stuff in the beginning. Is that a path worth going down?
Yeah. If you're buying a used machine, of course, there's a lot more opportunity for something to be kind of weird on it. So I would maybe ask a friend with experience. If you're newer to riding, ask somebody with a little bit more experience to just maybe look things over. If all is well, then yeah, I would encourage people start experimenting. And that's actually one thing that I was really intentful about when I started doing tuning commercially for the public, is I didn't want to be, pardon my French, but I didn't want to be anybody's clicker bitch. And so you'll often find that I won't adjust somebody's clickers out in the field because I'm not always going to be available. I want to empower people to experiment and understand how their machines work. All the manufacturers went through a lot of effort in manufacturing these adjuster circuits, the suspension manufacturers went through a lot of effort to make that so that it was available for the rider to tinker with. The manuals, they have most manuals have a pretty decent explanation of the function of everything. But with that said, how that actually translates to how the machine works, you're just going to have to start experimenting. And I understand, it can be a little daunting. A lot of people are honestly really afraid to try experimenting for fear of losing their way. I assure you that you won't make the bike go from rideable to unrideable by adjusting the clickers. You will change its characteristics, but it's not going to make the machine like unrideable, which I actually hate using that term. Everything's rideable. It just might be really, really sketchy. But yeah, it's just one of those things where, dedicating some time to tinkering with your clickers and maybe trying to not do it in a social setting. I find that people really, really struggle to gain an understanding of those things when doing it in a social setting. So like a group ride or whatever, there's way too many other dynamics in the group and distractions that it's really, really hard to make sense of it all. So, maybe pick an area that's got a little bit of a variety of, maybe a little bit faster stuff, a couple whoops and rollers, maybe a little slower segment with some rocky stuff. And then, give yourself a few hours to go warm up and then come back and like turn your compression clicker clockwise 10 clicks and then go ride the same loop and be like, okay, well, it maybe did feel like I felt more of the bump or in a whoop or a roll, or it didn't quite go fall down through the stroke as far. You can start gaining that understanding and confidence in what those things will do, and maybe be less scared of it, knowing that you can always put it back to where you started, and and it'll be fine.
Right. Yeah, I think the group ride thing, there's a lot of reasons to start exploring solo little rides, or not even rides necessarily, but go out by yourself and play around from a training perspective too. Like it's so much more beneficial. I mean, groups fun, small groups fun, but it's hard to hone in and work on the same thing over and over and over, or like you were saying, get a really feel for the bike, because there's so many other dynamics of the group. Like you want to keep up, or maybe you're trying to be faster than the person behind you, or whatever it is, it's hard to pay attention to those things.
I actually now that you mentioned that, using riding as a means for building fitness, it's not too dissimilar. Like the more you invest in it, the more you'll get back. So you can't expect to go to the gym. Like how can I draw? You could have a gym membership, but if you don't have the discipline to go all the time, it's not going to make a difference. Whereas somebody with a single dumbbell with a disciplined ethic or schedule is going to build a lot more fitness. So
yeah,
really, it's the discipline in making yourself go try and start tinkering with your suspension to really, really gain an understanding. And that's the thing. It's like, man, it takes a long time it's a slippery slope, because next thing you know, you own a suspension shop. But if anything, I encourage people at least to understand kind of the limits. And I think that's what, you get to a certain point in your suspension tinkering journey to where you're like, okay, I've kind of been at both limits now. I understand what too stiff of a setting feels like. I understand what too soft of a setting feels like. And now I kind of know what parameters to exist within.
right.
I think that's, it takes a long time to arrive there, and you have to be willing to experiment what works best for you. And I know it is daunting, but it all starts with that first click. You gotta block out all the noise, start tinkering with stuff in a controlled environment as you're able, to really hone in on how you can impact how that machine works.
Right. Yeah, I think the correlation works in the sense that you could have the perfect program written for you exactly for your type. You could get all the blood tests done. You could find out how much sleep you need, how much you can train each day without overtraining, what foods to eat. But if you don't do any of it, it doesn't do you any good. But that person who doesn't have any of that shit has one dumbbell and's just knocking it out of the park every day, training hard, knows the ins and outs of that one dumbbell, has come up with 30, 40 creative exercises that work for him that he does, but they do it consistently. They're going to be miles ahead. You could have a $3,000 suspension setup, ride twice a year, never do anything, go out, have a horrible experience, not because the suspension sucks, because you suck, right?
I mean,
or you could have a stock bike and just go crush, play with the clickers, ride every day, tinker, take notes, think about it, and you're going to be miles ahead.
I mean, yeah, and that's the crazy thing is both of those scenarios exist. I know people in both of those situations, and I've had to help people in both of those situations. And the rider who's out there logging 200 hours on their bike a season, it's going to be, that's almost a little bit easier conversation to have than it is the rider who's invested heavily into suspension and just for whatever reason, I know life gets in the way, has not been able to commit to AC time, or just as bad, being able to tinker with this premium equipment that they invested in. And so it's like, what do you do when, somebody's certain that what's holding them back is the quality and or the premium level of their suspension, and like you said, they ride once every few weeks and they're not comfortable on the machine. It's like, well, I'm not comfortable doing anything I do once every 3 weeks, whatever it is. Like, that sounds incredibly unnatural.
Right.
So, and especially when the consequences of not doing it right is crashing and getting hurt, or just getting really tired and not being able to keep up. So that's a really, really difficult conversation to have with somebody. Is like, like there's not much we can do until you commit to riding.
Right.
Because like you said, there's a lot of people out there actually that are on really haggard, clapped out equipment that rip.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and that's the thing, like even riding quite a bit and the same machine, you will have a day or two let's say you get out 5 days a week. I would almost guarantee one of those days, at least once, if maybe once every twice a week, is going to feel terrible. Like you will literally feel like this isn't my machine. Hands feel weird, feet feel weird, can't stay on the pegs, whatever it is. Like, and that's part of the growing curve. Like, I just think that's part of it.
Man, yeah, that one actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I just had an experience like that recently. My first major experience with that was way back in the day when I was in Moto still and doing tuning and all that. I was, basically a full-on Moto guy. The track we had been riding, we had one really good local track. So much of my time was spent at that track. I didn't have a super diverse skill set riding wise because we really only had one or maybe two good local resources. So I was really, really good. We were collectively, our group was really, really good at what we were comfortable with and what we had close. But anytime the conditions kind of went outside that, man, I specifically remember one day there was this corner. It usually had these big wave ruts that, will collapse on themselves. Is at the end of a long straightaway. You could come smoking in that thing so hot. Just pretty much drop the bike on its side and rail these ruts, and it was awesome. One day the prep was a little bit drier. The conditions were they weren't rutty. It was more kind of loamy, and man, I had such a hard time making my bike corner. I had my clickers so jacked up. I was screwing with so much stuff on my bike. And I eventually got so frustrated. I just sat there in the corner and just sat there and watched people. And a lot of other people were actually struggling with similarly, pushing the front end around all weird, or blowing the rear out, not being able to maintain and hold traction in that corner. And I forget who it was exactly, somebody that spends a lot more time racing regionally. And so a much wider variety of conditions, and they railed through the corner. I watched their body English and handling. I was like, oh my god, I realized what I was doing. I got so used to dropping a shoulder, dropping an elbow, kind of even like dropping my head into a rut, because the rut will hold you. A lot of times the ruts won't punish your technique. It's a different kind of technique than a flat or low mirror corner. Whereas a flat or low mirror corner, staying a little bit more up on the corner of the seat, driving your outside, thigh into the shroud, obviously driving down with your ball of your foot into the peg, looking ahead. I wasn't doing a lot of those things just because we got so used to just riding our ruts, which, like I said, once you're used to ruts, your technique can kind of fall apart a little bit on any other condition. So I watched this rider ripping, like, okay, I went back to the pits, but all my clickers back to where they had worked for the previous month, right? Like, it's not like my bike was all of a sudden trash, but that was the first thing I thought. I was like, oh, my bike's jacked up. It's definitely not me. So, yeah, it was a big learning moment for me. Yeah, I must have been back in like 2009 or so, and I was like, okay, you got to step back and look at the whole sample set of the last 20 rides. This thing has been great, and then this one outlier, the bike's still fine. It's definitely not the bike. And so I adjusted my technique, immediately felt was like that comfortable, and was right back in action. So but yeah, and that's more being stuck in a condition. Your comment on having off days, that's another big one. And I actually just learned something recently that I believe that there's mental off days and then there's physical off days.
Yeah.
I didn't really know that there was a difference until they both hit me at once, and it was probably one of the worst days of riding I've had in a long time. Not mentally engaged, life stress, etc. Physically, just didn't feel great. Haven't been riding consistently, just kind of felt weak and off. And then having both of those things on the same days is awful. Like, when you're not feeling stoked, like, listen to your gut, man. Don't just force yourself to go full blown into a rock garden, because you will end up on your head.
It's been interesting paying attention to those days, because I've been real consistent out on the trials bike this summer. And every day was basically a good day for like a month. So like, I don't know, probably 5-6 days a week, I was getting a lot of time on there. And then one day, it was like the first bad day I had, and like, missed the peg, scratched the calf all the way up with new pegs that I just put on. And I like was trying to turn the bike around, and rock pile wasn't quite paying attention, and had my foot on a rock, and the case came down on top of my foot. But luckily there were 2 rocks that my tires hit, so it didn't break my foot. Like, it was just one of those things. And I just had to stop and sit there and be like, I don't know, we're just going to pack it in and go home, or and I was like, I could still just go in the flats and like work on turns or something where I can't hurt myself. But
yeah, man, that's
it happens.
Yeah. And it's important to I don't know, yeah, you got to mitigate your risks at that point, because yeah, you could easily try and put your head down and whatever and hurt yourself, and then what are you going to do? Now you're not training for until you're healed.
Right.
So
but that does come into the suspension conversation, because it felt like the bike was fucked up.
Right.
I know. I could have left there
all the time.
I could have left there and just been like, this thing's trash. I need, this, and this. And then really within like a couple of days, it's kind of back to where I was and feeling good again.
Yeah. That's another real one. And and everyone's different. Some people have more off days than others. Some people, unfortunately, are almost in a perpetual state of off days. I'm serious. I only say this because, as you can imagine, I've talked to a lot of people throughout my tuning career, and so you're gonna hit some of these outliers in a sense, that just have constant struggles with handling, or I should say handling, or confidence, or just riding. And those are really, really hard ones. And, my heart goes out to him because, man, to not feel quite right, and not be like stoked on your bike, at least most of the time, that sounds like a hard place to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, some of it you just can't fix, right? And because that's why they're calling me, is to hopefully be able to fix some of it. And you get through. The one thing I've noticed, things you learn over time. One question I ask more and more of is I dig up a little more history. So, how many times have you had something tuned in the past? If not by me, how many tuners have you had in the past? And if I'm like eighth or 10th guy in the line of failed tuners, I'd be like, okay, well, I don't think I'm particularly special. Um, what's the common denominator here? This person maybe just has a sensitivity that I won't be capable of meeting. And so I kind of don't want to set myself up for failure.
Right. That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, no, there's nothing. That's the thing, is like, there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
It's just, yeah, at the end of the day, I want to make people stoked on their machines. And if I can't help that, or if the outcome is looking bleak, why put us both through that?
Right.
Giving both of us some time.
Yeah. All right. Some technical stuff quickly. What is rebound and what's it do when you go plus or minus?
Okay, so rebound, I guess as a general statement, rebound is the action of the suspension extending, so recovering after a compression. Rebound damping is what controls the release of the spring energy, or the speed in which the rebound occurs. The analogy I like to use, and this applies to most clickers, is think of them as a faucet. Because you have the plus minus conversation. Well, does that mean more flow or more damping, or less flow? And it's like, well, plus usually means clockwise, which restricts flow, so it's going to make it move slower. Counterclockwise is usually minus. That usually increases flow and reduces damping. So that's usually the way I try and explain it to people, is just think of your clicker as a faucet. And more flow is going to allow it to move easier. Less flow is going to cause it to move slower on either compression or rebound.
And what about compression?
Yeah, same thing. And depending on the design of the fork or shock, shocks, the adjusters, the locations are pretty consistent. In most cases, compression is on the top of the shock, and rebound on the bottom. On forks, it depends on the architecture of the fork. A twin chamber, usually, I mean, I can't think of an instance where it's not, but on a twin chamber, usually the compression is on top, the rebound is on bottom. Or in an asymmetrical system, so what's on the KTM Enduro line, so the XCWs, TEs, anything with the Explorer fork, both of the adjusters are on top. They're usually labeled on the fork cap, but same thing. Clockwise is going to slow down the flow and stiffen it. Counterclockwise is the opposite.
So if you're gonna, let's say you haven't messed with anything yet and you're looking to start playing around, is there a better one to start with?
Assuming that you've got your spring rates in the right spot. So yeah, that answer depends on whether or not if you're trying to resolve a symptom, you got to make sure that you're resolving the problem. So you're like, okay, I feel some harshness, right? That's probably one of the biggest things that I get asked about to resolve. I'm getting harshness, and it's like, okay, let's step back and look at who you are and what you're doing. 150-pound rider on a SXF in the rocks. Okay, it's not using enough stroke. That's where your harshness is coming from. Highly likely. I can say that with almost certainty that we need to make it softer. 230 30-pound rider, 40-pound rider that's riding an XCW or a TE at fair intensity, fair amount of traction, and they're experiencing some harshness or deflection, that's very likely that it's because they're riding too low in the stroke. It's too soft. They're getting into the really hyper progressive part of the force curve of either the fork or shock, and there's no more travel left to absorb the bump or the feature, and so that's going right to your hands. It's almost bottoming or even deflecting. So which one to work on first? That assumes that you don't have some other problem going on. But I would say generally speaking, just for gaining an awareness of what everything does, go out and just warm up on a little test circuit, and then click both of your fork and shock compression adjusters stiffer or clockwise 5 clicks, and see how it feels. It's not going to react dramatically different, but you should be able to feel 5 clicks. Now, I will say that some fork designs, the compression adjuster is less effective than others. For example, the KTM Husqvarna group, the Explorer fork, the compression adjusters on those are practically useless. So you could actually probably in a blind test, and we did early on in testing, adjust the compression adjuster almost fully open to fully closed, and the rider couldn't really tell a difference. So on the topic of gaining some understanding and awareness in what the things do, if you're on an XCW or a TE with the Explorer fork, the first thing you go to do is tinker with the compression to see how it feels. You're going to lose all your confidence because it's not going to feel really different just because that's the way that fork is. But any other model, let's take like a Sherco or a Beta that has the twin chamber Kayaba fork on it. You should notice a fair difference in 5 compression clicks of the fork, especially doing it back to back with riding a circuit, literally just stopping long enough to make the adjustment and then riding the same circuit again. You're going to notice a difference, and you have to decide whether or not that change was desirable or undesirable, and then try going the other way and be like, oh, it's becoming more desirable, more comfortable, whatever, the further direction I go. So just keep going until it starts becoming undesirable again, the other direction. And somewhere in the middle there is going to be your baseline setting that will work in all of the terrain you're riding.
Makes sense.
Are you taking notes?
Yeah. Well, it's just funny because it is so much of a trial and error situation. Like outside of, again, some kind of standard starting base points. From there, it matters what kind of terrain you're riding, how much you're riding, how aggressive, what style of riding you do. If you're real aggressive, if you're a little bit more laid back, hard enduro, track, sand, desert, it's just so dependent.
Sure.
So the ultimate question is, can you have one setup that does everything really well?
You can have one setup that you can do everything on. However, it's good the further you get away from. Okay, so I've rode a Moto setting in Rocky Enduro. I got through it. I got super tired. I had low confidence in any kind of I would say softball size or bigger features at lower speeds. There's just a ton of chassis feedback, but I still got through it. And it took more energy. I was more tired. I couldn't do that probably for an 80+ mile day. I would have to take a lot of breaks. The run while moving, could move at a pretty fast pace because I would have to get the suspension to work right. But I'd probably have to stop and take a lot of breaks. Conversely, can you ride an enduro setup on a moto track? You can, but there's going to be spots where you got to be really, really careful. Depending on what kind of track you're riding, if it's a more open, flowy, amateur track, you'll be fine. If you're getting into more advanced, tighter transitions and stuff, peakier whoops and stuff like that, that's where you really can start putting yourself in danger. But it can be done. So can a bike be ridden in all disciplines with one setting? Yes, but it's not going to be optimal.
Right.
I will say by investing in more premium equipment, you usually have a wider range of adjustability in which it'll work. And that's a lot of times, that's usually the justification for investing in more premium equipment, like doing full on cartridge swaps or upgrading to like an aftermarket, kit style, complete shock unit. Um, a lot of times the greatest benefit are riders that are wanting it to work well in a wider range of discipline and want that range of adjustability. Um, so yeah, it can be done, but if you actually got on a dedicated moto setup, that's going to outperform an all around setup for that specific discipline. So
Right. So probably as an athlete or rider, the I don't want to say the better you are, but the more you want to pursue a specific discipline, the more it matters to get your bike set up specifically for that. Like it'll make big difference.
yeah, yep, absolutely. However, I do find that a lot of times the multi-disciplined athletes, um, they have an easier time usually adapting to the changing conditions within a discipline, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So, it's I would say like a good example would be Aaron Plessinger, pro motocrosser, supercross rider, comes from a GNCC background. Um, the more the conversation's always been the more snotty, ruddy, weird, muddy, if it's a mudder, people are like, oh, Aaron Plessinger is he's used to riding in this stuff. And I can't say that I remember off the top of my head whether or not that's actually been the case to where he just like stomped everybody in a mud race. I'm trying to think. Yeah, he's kind of actually been a little hit and miss lately, um, but generally speaking, at least on the local and regional level, it's not always uncommon to find, a good hair scramble rider keeping dedicated moto guys honest on the moto track.
Right.
Um, and especially if the conditions are more variable or unpredictable. Um, so yes, getting a dedicated setup could help a single discipline or will help a single disciplined athlete maximize what they're doing in that discipline. But I also encourage people to broaden their horizons um, and try different riding disciplines. A lot of locally, it has me and some of the more vet guys now that had gotten out of moto and into off road. We ride a ton of off road and occasionally hit moto races. It's been really, really fun to see how our line selections have changed, how our racecraft has changed, as compared to people that have stayed dedicated moto riders. And it's been really, and their ability to conform or adapt to changing conditions. Um, so yeah, it's definitely beneficial for a single discipline athlete to get a dedicated suspension set or tune. However, I do encourage people to always like kind of stretch their boundaries as far as what they're comfortable in riding.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that conversation goes for a lot of things. I mean, I don't remember who said it first, but nature abhors the specialist, and it's a pretty cool thought experiment when you
What was it
start.
again?
Nature abhors the specialist,
Oh, sure.
so just expanding your horizons and getting out there and trying new things all the time.
For sure. Um, yeah, man. Actually, one thing I wanted to touch on too, being a fitness expert, uh, and how that ties to suspension setup, because this is something I personally have kind of been dealing with as a rider. As I have gotten older, more responsibilities, I've not been able to make the commitment to fitness that I would like to. I don't know, no excuses, but my suspension setup has changed based on my fitness level. I'm curious for you, because you and I have gone through a couple revisions now of builds.
Yeah.
And so, what's that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how, being somebody who I think is super fit, um, how has this most recent tune, um, how has it benefited you? Do you feel like you've been able to maximize more on your fitness as a result?
Yeah. And I feel like it's taken however long it's taken to get there. Like,
Sure.
I'm trying to think. What we do the first time, it was just that
Symmetrical valving conversion. It's
yeah.
almost like the bare minimum you can do to that fork. Um, yeah, it's almost the bare minimum you can do to that fork.
Yeah. And springs, and because again, I'm a heavy rider. And that was great. And it worked really good for a while. And then eventually got to a point, actually, we were all kind of riding together. And I had a couple front end washouts that at the time, like it wasn't, I'm very hesitant to blame equipment. Like it takes me a while to start blaming the tools that I'm using. I feel like it's usually
Sure.
the operator. And
Sure.
so I'll chalk most things up to rider error on my part, unless it's consistently happening when I get to a point where I'm like, I feel like this shouldn't be happening.
Sure.
And what was happening was when we were going pretty quickly through some areas with some basically braking bumps and then a hard left or right, but I'd lost the front end and just blew the trail, at a pretty good clip, like enough to be like, I don't want to do a whole lot of that. And
Sure.
I think I remember having a conversation with you and kind of telling you what was going on. And then we did the, I don't know, the pro cartridge
Yep.
for it. And it was night and day, like the next time I rode. And
Sure.
then since then, it's just been an uptick in confidence, really. Like
Sure.
that's how I would explain it. It's not that, and I think we stiffened up the springs too, a little bit.
Yeah, I'd have to look at my notes. I don't remember specifically, but probably.
Because the other thing that was happening for me is in the more hard enduro stuff on it wasn't the ups, it was the downs. But any type of big drop, I would just felt like I'd go over the bars way too easy or be scared of going over the bars,
Sure.
And so by stiffening that up, that made a big difference there as well. Like those were
Sure.
the two main things for me. I don't know. I mean, I'm not, you said here are the wrenches for the clickers and do that. And I don't think I've touched them since. I just keep riding.
Yeah, and so I think that's an interesting thing in that, and this is another thing that I encourage people to understand is similarly to commitment to gym time, similarly to commitment to going out and tinkering with clickers and whatnot, seeing what it does. The same can be applied to the relationship with the tuner. So we only arrived to where we're at now because of the path. Now kind of reflecting on that and thinking back to, okay, why did I set it up the way I set it up the first time? I was under, and now kind of remembering, I was under the impression like it's going to be a dedicated first gear hard enduro weapon, super compliant front end, energy conserving. But you use the bike for everything. You still rip fast single track on it. And most of your lack of confidence was occurring at speed now. Just like,
Right.
oh, okay, this is just as easily an enduro setup, not a dedicated hard enduro first gear bike. This thing still has to work in third and fourth. And so that's where it's like, well, we can only do so much with that the simple architecture of the SVC. At a certain point, making that leap to a much more refined cartridge system is going to give us a lot of what we need. And so, you know, again, it's like you could have just as easily said, hey, you know what, this didn't work, screw this guy. And you know, you might go to the next guy, you might end up with the same exact thing because
Right.
you're not interpreting interpreting your information correctly. And that, that was, you know, yeah. So it's one of those things where I encourage people not to like tuner hop, because the more time you're willing to invest with the tuner and they have a better understanding of what you want, because you almost have to start over with a new tuner every time, so they can, I mean, to some degree, I mean, they can look at what you got going on currently, and that's the benchmark, and then go from there. But it's a lot easier if you have that relationship and that history to get you set up right, the first time. Um, but yeah, so anyway, it's yeah, and also knowing like, yeah, you're really really strong, so you can handle something on the stiffer side, like for sure.
Right.
Even in really really rocky terrain. So now I know that.
Right.
So
No, and it was interesting. I mean, we had just recently, I had, it was feeling really chattery in the front and harsh and all, and I haven't had a major wreck or anything. So it's not like I twisted up the front end, but my moose was completely shot. It was just time for new one, and the front tire was smoked. You know,
sure.
and in the back of my head, I kind of knew that, but I was also, and I hadn't bled the air for like 2 months. And so
I'm ending this call right now.
and so I did that. And then yeah, put a new moose, new tire. And again, it was immediately back to where I was. And I was like, sweet, felt great.
Right. Yeah. And so those are the questions that, yeah, the I gotta be sure to ask, before we go, because what can happen is, like, yeah, front end harshness, yeah, I'm like, okay, we got a little more compliance, revalve it a little bit, do all that, you get it back, and then you put a front tire on, and you're like, wow, this is way too soft,
Right.
because you aren't smacking the rim anymore because you're blowing out loosened tire, but I've now softened the valving, so you got some of your quote unquote suspension back with your tire setup, but now I've softened the valving, so now we got to undo everything.
Right.
So yeah, that's always one, that's, you got to keep an eye on that one. Or yeah, both, I do as a tuner, I have to keep an eye on that one and make sure I'm asking the right questions and making sure we're not trying to resolve some other issue that isn't suspension related. And I get it, like people are like, oh well, the energy still has to come through the suspension before it gets to the rider. Why can't you resolve that with suspension? Well, there is just like a certain amount of like mechanical shock when you're striking the rim on a rock. Like the only thing that's going to help that is just putting more rubber between you and the rock and dampen handlebar or something. But it's
Right.
like you can't just do it all in the valving. So yeah. Anyway, yeah, I'm glad you resolved that before you do it.
Well, that, and I mean, the other part of that is the inputs that come from the rider. So I mean, not to harp on it, but back to the fitness part of riding, the more fit you are, the more aggressive you're going to be longer,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
Everybody's aggressive in the first 15 minutes, but
Yeah.
as those hours start to stretch out, things change. So the feel of the bike's going to change because the inputs that you're putting into it are different. I mean, when you're riding aggressively, it's going to respond completely different than when you're riding on the back of the seat sitting down. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. Yeah. You're absolutely, yeah. And that's a big one with off-road riding. Just because of the durations, more like the cross country hare scramble crowd. Um, yeah, and you got to be really, really careful when you're testing too, because uh, the more recovery time you have between these sprints, in a sense, like these testing sprints, I usually like to have the rider go out and get tired before we even start talking about suspension.
Oh,
Like
that's good.
be on the machine for an hour before we even start jacking with anything, because how you might go out and, yeah, like you said, in that first 15 minutes might be completely different from your settled in pace. And you want to set the bike up for for the majority of what's going on. So you might be able to just completely manhandle a thing through rocks in those first, honestly, hour. But then, yeah, if you start falling apart in your back seat, and you're slowing way down for any rock garden, that's not advantageous. You got to know that there's an average or a median in there somewhere, and actually when I was still kind of doing more off-road oriented racing, um, that was an interesting realization for me. Was I don't want to say like listening to my bike or listening to my suspension, but I could almost kind of let my suspension tell me when I was overriding, and that I wasn't going to make it. Like I was riding too hard, too aggressively, and I wouldn't be able to maintain this pace, to the end of the race, or I would drop off substantially. So that was a really, really cool understanding too. Is it's like, okay, my bike feels like it feels like it's not supporting me, like it's under supported, when really I was just overriding it, and I needed to just back off that 5%. And then I could have a much, much stronger end of the race. And I remember years ago, but this is quite a while ago, there was an off-road race. It was like a 4 hour, I think it was a 6 hour race. So it was the longest race that I'd ever done. And it was like more hare scramble speeds, higher speeds. And I had spent the previous 2 weeks testing just for myself, just because of like, I never raced that long in my life before, and I don't even know what a 6 hour race pace feels like. The most that I ever done was 3 hours at an XC. So I'm going double that. Like, I don't even know what to do. So I spent the 2 weeks like testing on it, and I'd go out on 4 hour days and be like, okay, like I'm tired, but I still got gas in the tank. Like, and I had to actually soften it up quite a bit. And I knew that the course would get hacked up quite a bit because of the amount of traffic on it in 6 hours. It was also a team marathon race, so you had some teams that were splitting. You had the option of either doing a team or an Ironman. So it's like, okay, there's going to be a whole bunch of people out here that are doing 1 or 2 laps at a time, going, I don't know, 15 to 30 minutes at a time. They're going to be going at a way different pace. It's definitely still going to tear up the dirt, create holes and bumps. It's going to get rough. It's not like everyone was just cruising on, cruise control and not tearing it. Like, it was still going to get rough. And so, dude, I was a wreck over it, like trying to figure out how I was going to ride for 6 hours at whatever a 6 hour race pace intensity could be.
Right.
And so, yeah, leading up to the race, and then, I got to where I felt, okay, I feel like this is an okay setting. One of the last kind of test rides I did, I was like, all right, yeah, I think I can maintain this for 6 hours. I definitely felt that at any time I could drop the hammer and totally override the bike. But I'm like, but I can't do that for 6 hours. If I dropped to like a 2 hour pace, the thing was pretty bad. Like, I was clanking it off everything. There's a lot of big rollers on this course and stuff too. Where I just backed off a little, played with the terrain a little more, hop stuff, just kind of doubled rollers, and was a lot more conservative. Race day came. My fastest lap was my last lap at the end of 6 hours, which was really, really rewarding and cool. And
yeah, it's awesome.
I came out pretty relaxed. Like, I was just straight up just like cruising for the first 2 hours, like trying to keep my heart rate low. It's like, I'm going to be on my bike for 3 hours before I'm even starting the same duration that I'm used to.
Right.
So I was like, the race doesn't start for another 3 hours for me. I'm just riding my bike around for 3 hours first, and then I'm going to start racing. So that was a really interesting experiment or realization with, and at the time I still had, a lot better fitness than I do now. My hands were pretty well seasoned. Yeah, it was just a really interesting, I don't know, realization, just having that fitness to suspension setup equation, and how, a lot of people I think now go off heart rate probably in measuring their output. At the time, all I was using was my bike's control.
Yeah.
If I was swapping and bottoming out, I was like, I'm overriding it. I'm going at a pace that I can't maintain for 6 hours. So again, yeah, just kind of an interesting anecdote on fitness and suspension setup.
Yeah, that's really cool, because it is interesting. Like, the flip side of that would be probably endurocross, right? 10 minutes of absolute red line,
Yeah.
right? Hammering off obstacles, massive air, sketchy matrix, logs, rocks, whatever.
Totally.
Which is complete opposite of, 6-hour Ironman event, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. Those two settings couldn't be more different. Yeah, and you're not looking at energy conversation or energy conservation, in enduro cross necessarily. You're looking at
Maybe
maximum
2%, right? Like,
yeah,
just a scotch, just enough to maintain control.
right. Yep.
Just back off red line enough to where you're not arm pumped in half the race.
Yeah, and the bars rip out of your hands. Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally different animal, and yeah, that's wild actually. The enduro cross thing, that whole thing's gnarly, actually. I know a few of our friends have been bopping around at some of the rounds, and I'm sure you've gotten peer pressured in trying to join. I'm like, no, dude, those days are gone for me.
I think who was I talking to? And Joe Nemeth. And I said I wasn't interested at all, but then, God damn, if I lived closer to the action, it would be. It's just such a traveling thing, but it is intriguing. I mean, just there's so much carryover to the skill set of hard enduro in that, I mean, there is and there isn't, but the aggressiveness of some of that would pay off in hard enduro would be where I think it'd be really cool. And then with the way that the courses are just getting, gnarlier and gnarlier, because you do have to have some of those skill sets, being comfortable through rock gardens at higher speeds and very comfortable getting the front end up and double blipping over stuff or whatever it may be.
Yeah, tire doubles. Are you ready to hit a tire double with a giant log in the landing?
I mean, absolutely not, but you got to start somewhere.
Right?
Yeah. No, we got to, at the gym here, we got some concrete barriers that I finally started getting out and practicing on and on filming. And because it's one thing to think you're doing something right. And then, I mean, because I'm getting over it, right? And like landing flat on the other side. But then really watching the video and breaking it down, I'm like, oh, I got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's a little disheartening, actually. I would say those trials techniques are one of the more disheartening. Yeah, you watch yourself. Yeah, classic example, the Jersey barrier thing. It's like the Jersey barrier is huge boost in confidence until you watch somebody that truly understands trials technique and the whole rear tire lift concept. It's like, holy smokes, like I don't even know where to put me back on a 12-inch tall log like that I could just ride over normally,
right.
but like it's a whole different animal. Yeah, watching yourself on video is very humbling.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good for the soul for sure. I don't know. I got some questions I was gonna ask you just from our Instagram here, but you got anything else you want to mention or talk about on this?
I mean, I could go for another 6 or 9 hours for sure, but I don't think I don't think your demo is interested in most of what I have to say on it.
All right, I got one. What kind of rear spring can I put on a 22 Husky TE 150i to make it softer in the rear?
A 2020 TE 150i to make it softer in the rear. So that's still going to be the current 50 millimeter Gen 2 WP shock. It's just a 60 by 260 shock. Spring rate wise, I believe the 150s came with a 42 Newton. I'd have to look in the manual. I remember off the top of my head. I don't work on a ton of 150s, but look in the manual. They do a pretty good job of laying out spring rates based on rider weight. But yeah, if the rider's geared weight is in that range of whatever the spring rate below stock is, that's definitely a great place to start to gain more comfort and use more stroke and travel over features. So
Awesome. That was from Alicia 210 Proch. Next
Yeah,
one.
they could also slide in my DMs on the Deja page, and if they have some technical questions or spring rate recommendations, just feel free to ask, and I'll get to them when I can.
Cool. This is a pretty technical one here. When is the next Deja merch should drop?
Oh boy.
Hunter Clark 27 says he needs some more shop rags.
Oh boy, he's gonna get charged double on the next service. Oh yeah, man. Anymore it's all hands on deck, just trying to get the work done. And it's one of those things, especially now with the release of the new chassis for KTM, um, doing testing and setting development and stuff like that. Um, I guess I'm maybe at a point in my business journey to where brand expansion and brand growth is not a huge priority to me. And so, doing things like merch and all that are just a distraction. I just want to be able to set up people's dirt bikes so that they have a ton of fun riding them. And in order for me to do that, I gotta stay focused on the more technical side of stuff. But who knows? I might have a weak moment and spend a bunch of time trying to get the whole merch thing lined up. So I guess stay tuned.
Nice. We got two questions from our esteemed climb friend, Lucas Eddy here. What's the difference between bopping and pussing, and is it important?
Oh my God, what an idiot. It's all important. If you know, you know. That's all I can say.
And then last, this seems like a good one to end on. How do you get your shit to slap, as they say?
Bend over and I'll show you.
Nice.
What an idiot. You know what? Like, I don't know if you have this same experience, Josh, but it's a lot of fun, actually. It's no secret that I've got some aspirations outside of Deja Moto, the suspension brand. I was a machinist in the past, and I really miss machining, and so I want to kind of re-enter that atmosphere in that market. Um, I can only imagine at some point the demands of that is going to start taking away from Deja. Um, so the one thing that kind of bums me out of that on that idea is like all the relationships, like all the cool people you get to meet in the moto industry. And Lucas being one of them, that's what made me think about it. And like yourself, and there's just a lot of really fun, cool people, Joe Brown, Chris, and all that that you get to meet. And that are people that are just stoked on moto, stoked on dirt bikes, or whatever their power sports passion may be, and they've decided to incorporate it into their livelihood. And it's really cool seeing everybody hustling and trying to make the moto space bigger and better.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I've truly enjoyed getting to know you through this, and the work you've done for Dana and I and stuff. And yeah, it's been great.
For sure, man.
Right on. Well, let people know real quick where they can get a hold of you, contact you, see what you're up to.
Yeah. Probably the easiest thing is first just like hit me up on Instagram, or I think I have a website. I don't know if any of it's current. Like I said, brand growth has not been a goal, and I'm turning kind of a lot of work away lately. Or I should say I'm focusing mostly, I've had to narrow my scope of work to just doing kind of modern WP and Kayaba setups. So people that have that, by all means, hit me up. I usually turn most work that's outside of that away, just so that I can at least be really, or try and be really good at a narrower scope rather than being just mediocre at a lot of things. But yeah, people can hit me up with Instagram, or call the number on my website. It is my personal cell number, so that I don't love giving it out to everybody because I get anymore. I just actually just keep my phone on silent because the amount of just, uh, telemarketing and whatnot is just out of control. So anyway, yeah, best thing would probably just be hit me up on Instagram and I'll hit you with my cell number. So
Awesome. Right on. Well, appreciate the time, and yeah, we'll have to do this again at some point.
sounds good, Josh. Coming ride next weekend.
Yep, hope so.
Awesome. Let's get that pipe all smashed up.
Yeah. Right on. Thanks.